Ask any of the millions of Harry Potter fans worldwide how to get to Hogwarts, and they'll tell you that you have to take the Hogwarts Express from King's Cross Station. It's a fitting transport, considering a train is where the whole world of Harry Potter began. In 1990, a young woman named Joanne Rowling was stuck on a train for 4 hours between Manchester and King's Cross Station when the idea for Harry Potter grew in her mind. Over the next 5 years, and through divorce, the death of her mother, and birth of a daughter, Rowling created the world of Harry Potter, mostly in coffee shops around Edinburgh. When the book was finally finished in 1995, Rowling sent the manuscript to dozens of publishers, all of whom turned her down. That is, until a publisher from the small publication house Bloomsbury made the wise choice to give the book to his 8-year-old daughter, Alice. It turns out that the best judges of children's literature are children. An hour later, Alice returned, glowing about the book and begging her father to find out what happens next.
At the time J.K. Rowling was writing and trying to get the Harry Potter books published, fantasy books were not typically bought for children in bookstores. The books that were typically being sold were sports stories for boys and stories about ponies for girls. It was also thought that children's fiction at this time should be about real-life situations or have some sort of message involved, and should not include any sort of violence or mysticism. This book was also considered all wrong for publishing for many other reasons, such as it was about a boarding school and children that mouthed off to parents, as well as so many inherently British things mentioned in the book. And also, it was nearly 300 pages, which was about 3 times as long as a children's book should have been at that time. It was so surprising that it got published at all, also because it was non-politically correct and had a very odd title, as well as the fact that it was about magic and fantasy at a time when that was not something very popular in America especially. However, this book proved that it was not like other books, as it was able to get published and sold and became one of the most popular books sold in children's fiction.
What happened next was a publication offer that led to the publication of 7 foundational books. Those 7 books sold 500 million copies, were translated into 73 languages, adapted into 8 blockbuster films, and created a franchise worth $25 billion, becoming one of the most beloved book series ever published. Harry Potter is credited as popularizing the crossover genre, which is where adults are reading children's books and young adult books. Before Harry Potter, it wasn't common for an adult to read children's literature for their own entertainment. So the series was seen as the first to blur the line between children's literature and adult books. A lot of the adult readers of Harry Potter had an attachment to the series because they grew up reading those books and they continued to read them as they were released into their adulthood. But it wasn't just children and adults who grew up reading Harry Potter that were reading Harry Potter. It was everybody. So Harry Potter destigmatized children's literature as being beneath adults, and it opened up the market to a new demographic of reader. In a 2012 survey, it showed that 55% of young adult books were purchased by adults for their own entertainment. So not only did Harry Potter change children's books and the people who are reading them, it also introduced the concept of publishing children's literature as making good business sense. And so more children's literature entered the market, and as a result, more quality children's literature was entering the market. The publication of Harry Potter significantly impacted children's literature in a few ways. The first is that it introduced the idea of children's literature as potentially big business. Michelle Smith, who is the senior lecturer of literature at Deakin University, said that after the publication of Harry Potter, publishers began to realize that they could make more money by publishing books for children than they could by publishing books for adults. And that has shown up in the increase of children's literature sales since the publication of Harry Potter in comparison to the overall book market. So in 2004, which was about the height of Pottermania, children's books, even without the inclusion of the Harry Potter books, children's books were increasing by 2% every year. And since 2004, sales in the children's market has increased by 52% compared to the overall book market increase of 33%. So children's literature sales have significantly increased in comparison to the overall book market. Harry Potter also introduced the idea of franchising a book series through movie adaptations, all the theme parks that were created for Harry Potter, and the merchandise that is sold along with the books. Another way that Harry Potter impacted children's literature was in the books themselves. So Harry Potter revitalized the fantasy genre, which previously had started to become considered to be old-fashioned, so publishers weren't interested in publishing fantasy children's books. However, the popularity of the Harry Potter series showed publishers that there was a huge market for fantasy books and children's literature. So they started investing more in fantasy writers and fantasy books, and as a result, fantasy is now the dominant genre in children's literature. Another way that Harry Potter impacted children's books was in the page length. When Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was published, it was considered by many publishers to be too long at 223 pages. Before the publication of Harry Potter, books that were longer than 40,000 words were often turned down because they were considered to be too long, and children had short attention spans, so they wouldn't be able to read them. However, the Harry Potter books, especially with the publication of The Order of the Phoenix at 766 pages, prove that not only were children capable of reading longer books, but they were interested in reading longer books as well. And so, as a result, children's books are now longer. So since 1996, which is when Harry Potter was published, the length of children's books has increased from 140 pages to 290 pages in 2016. So not only did Harry Potter revitalize fantasy, it also opened the door for the publication of longer children's books. Harry Potter is credited as popularizing the crossover genre, which is where adults are reading children's books and young adult books. Before Harry Potter, it wasn't common for an adult to read children's literature for their own entertainment. So the series was seen as the first to blur the line between children's literature and adult books. A lot of the adult readers of Harry Potter had an attachment to the series because they grew up reading those books, and they continued to read them as they were released into their adulthood. But it wasn't just children and adults who grew up reading Harry Potter that were reading Harry Potter. It was everybody. So Harry Potter destigmatized children's literature as being beneath adults, and it opened up the market to a new demographic of reader. In a 2012 survey, it showed that 55% of young adult books were purchased by adults for their own entertainment. So not only did Harry Potter change children's books and the people who are reading them, it also introduced the concept of publishing children's literature as making good business sense. And so more children's literature entered the market, and as a result, more quality children's literature was entering the market.
Hey everybody, this is Erin, and I'm going to talk to you about Harry Potter and censorship. Um, it's an interesting subject and definitely a big part of the Harry Potter story. Um, Harry Potter was once the single most censored book across the world, and at the same time, it was becoming the single most successful book across the world. So it's kind of an interesting two-sided coin. So here we go. So most of my information for this slide comes from one particular essay by a woman whose last name is Gish. She was raised in a very fundamentalist church and was raised to believe that Harry Potter was evil and should absolutely be avoided at all costs. And she writes about the reasons behind that. It's a really interesting perspective, and this is one of the only few, if not the only, article I could find really from the perspective of someone who kind of saw the rationale given for censoring this book. So what she was saying was that people who had these very strong beliefs, particularly fundamentalist Christian beliefs, that led them to want to censor this book, they believe that witchcraft is real. And they believe that casual exposure to the occult can corrupt a child. So she was saying, if you believe that witchcraft is real and evil, then this book is not just a mere fantasy or an adventure tale. It is something very dark and sinister and with potential to cause great spiritual harm. And this stems from the belief that Christian teachings and scripture forbid witchcraft, sorcery, etc. And so the people wanting to censor this book want to protect their children from these things they consider harmful. She likened it to, protecting your child from doing something dangerous on the playground or touching a hot stove. And the problem, the additional problem that came from it is that Harry Potter displays witchcraft and wizardry in a way that's light and fun and desirable and positive. And she says that if it was displayed as negative and something that should be avoided, that the desire to censor this book from these fundamentalist groups would not be so strong, that they would even possibly see this as acceptable. Books where the witch or the wizard or the magical entity was the bad guy are still acceptable. I thought it was really interesting. So these groups also find the portrayal of muggles, which is non-magical persons, offensive. She said, what's so wrong with being non-magical? What's so wrong with being merely human as God created us? And then another article says that parents complained that the books had serious tones of death, hate, lack of respect, and sheer evil. So it's not just the magic that they found offensive, it was the fact that it actually discussed death. It actually discussed hate and even racism. There are a lot of parallels between Harry Potter and even Nazism or current neo-Nazism or post 9/11 racism. And there were a few articles I found that talked in depth about that. It was really interesting about how the latter half of the book set came about after 9/11, and it really changed the tone of the book in a way that made it fit with current times and be relevant, but also made it more of a target for censorship. And then, last but not least, the book promotes pranks, bad behavior, and delinquency. Childlike behaviors. How dare they? That is something that these people found offensive and therefore wanted the book banned so that no child could read it, and that their child would not have any accidental exposure to this book. So that's some of the rationales behind censoring this adventure story, fantasy novel, Harry Potter. So the controversy around Harry Potter began pretty much as soon as the books were published. There were parents and religious groups who saw this is about wizards, this is about magic, this is, putting those things in a positive light and therefore unacceptable, and I don't want my child being exposed to it, even accidentally or incidentally, and I don't want it in the libraries. So there was public outcry, there were protests and petitions and news articles and interviews, and all of that brought about a lot of publicity. And then the people who were not so interested in banning books of any kind found out about this wonderful new author, J.K. Rowling, and her fascinating series about a boy and his friends and the quest that they go on. There were book burnings, burning the Harry Potter books, among others. It's crazy to me to think about that this still goes on this day and age, but it does. Book burnings are a really powerful way to show opposition to any sort of cultural material, particularly books, of course, and always have been. And so this was really kind of an appalling thing that happened. The most recent book burning occurred in Poland in February of 2019. The priest has actually since come out and apologized and made some kind of mealy excuses for the behavior, but it still happens. But all that being said, Harry Potter is one of the most successful book series in the world, and he is a common household name. So their efforts kind of backfired. So I want to talk for just a second about the effect on subsequent children's literature. Harry Potter came about when the world was changing. A couple of the books were published pre-9/11, and books 3 onward were published after 9/11. And you can see that in the way the writing changes and the stories become a bit more dark and a bit more complex, and deal with issues of racism and the ineffectiveness of government entities at times. The Ministry of Magic, for instance, just not being able to handle this Voldemort problem. So it gave people a way to deal with their emotions around terrorism and growing racism, and kind of the scary new world that we lived in. And so it then spawned a generation of similar books. We have a vast new body of work of fantasy novels, quest novels, adventure novels, and most of them in series form, that were created after the Harry Potter success. And it showed that children and young adults want books that help them grapple with the real world. They want books that are meaty and long even, and touch on things that, are difficult and not just pleasant, Pollyanna kind of stories. And so it has changed children's literature for the foreseeable future, and in really interesting and I think positive ways. That's one of the lasting gifts of J.K. Rowling.